Welcome. My name is Diane Fenner for the New York City Bar Association, and today we are presenting part 2 of our conversations with Professor Noam Chomsky. We are very privileged to have him, and we recorded part 1 on April 13, but there were so many questions from our audience that we asked Professor Chomsky back, and he was generous and kind enough to agree to come back and answer the questions that had been left unanswered in the first session. So the part 1 already is posted on YouTube. And I will now turn over the microphone to my co-host, Suzanne Neinenberg of the Business and Human Relations Committee of the New York City Bar Association.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, thank you again for your truly thought-provoking presentation last week. As a brief recap, you spoke about the world order being in flux in terms of climate change and major events and shifts in US policy since World War II. You also spoke about power shifts in the global order and the US position relative to Europe, Russia, China, and the global South. And you made some truly fascinating observations that Putin's invasion in Ukraine is a triumph for Washington as it reestablished its relationship with Europe. But you also noted some critical points that the invasion puts the US position in the global world order to a test. You mentioned that the global South has not joined the US in Russian sanctions. The Russia and China relationship is now strengthening. And particularly, you questioned how long Europe, which is historically dependent on Russian minerals, will be willing to face decline by hanging on to Washington's coattails. And yeah, as Diane mentioned, when our hour was up, we were left with a long list of very interesting questions from our audience. And although I do not think that we will ever get to answer all the questions that your speech provoked, we do want to thank you for coming back so that we can take a deeper dive into these questions that came up in response to your comments. And I guess to start us off, you mentioned various man-made events that have shaped the world order, including 2 9/11s, the World War, the Vietnam War, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And we were just curious, how have these events shaped your thinking about the role of government in society?
Well, very much so. The first 9/11, 1973, we're now coming to the 50th anniversary. That was right in the midst of a period when I myself was deeply involved in both resistance against the Indochina War, which was its final stages then, and in the affairs of Latin America, which was in the midst of a plague of repression that was beyond anything else in its terrifying history back to the conquistadors launched by John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. And then when the first 9/11 came along, far worse than what we call 9/11, that naturally influenced considerably my own thinking about the events that were underway. There were commonalities between the United States, a global power. So when something's happening in one region, it's commonly happening in others as well. And in fact, the 50th anniversary of the first 9/11 happens to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the formal, though not actual, end of the Vietnam War with the Paris Agreement. And the Kissinger was at the center Kissinger and Nixon were at the center of both of these events, both the Paris negotiations and their effective rejection by the United States in practice, and of course the first 9/11, which was largely implemented by Kissinger and Nixon, and who strongly supported the criminal atrocities that followed. So there's trace them right back to Washington in both cases. And that, of course, influenced naturally my own perception of world affairs, a further dramatic indication of the power of the global hegemon to shape historical events. And take the other cases, same thing for each one. Of course, they had effects.
Yes, and you referenced the role of corporations and governments in these events and in the global order. One of our audience members is a former United Nations observer for the National Association of Women Lawyers, and she witnessed how effective national and global NGOs could be when consensus is achieved on a given topic. And it occurred to us that you did not mention the role of civil society, and she is wondering, do you believe that NGOs can be influential, and where do you see the role of civil society in a changing world order?
I think they don't have a direct effect on policy making. They may direct themselves to political leaders, as say I do too, but of course it's not intended to reach their ears. They don't listen. What it's intended for is a way of educating, mobilizing the public so that perhaps public opinion will crystallize, come together, act to change the calculus of choices that those in power make. And in fact, it does very strikingly. So take what we were just talking about, the peace agreement in 1973, 50 years ago. If you look at, there is by now, I can recommend a very good scholarly source that just appeared a couple of months ago, Carolyn Eisenberg's book. It's called, what's the title? I have it here, Fire and Rain, which is a detailed documentary study using declassified materials of how Nixon and Kissinger tried desperately to maintain US domination of Vietnam in the face of the fact that the population was uncontrollable. And one of the populations they were concerned with was the United States. It was the rising anti-war movement that they had to placate somehow in order to try to carry through their complicated geopolitical manipulations to try to strengthen the US position in Indochina. By then it was not just Vietnam. The United States was carrying out massive attacks in Cambodia and Laos under Kissinger's direction. And the question was how to maintain all this in the face of growing opposition in the United States. And this was before the modern age of NGOs, but there were similar organizations that were engaged very significantly in organizing on the ground, nationally, internationally. There was an international peace movement. It's not well studied because of its, these are kind of subversive phenomena. You don't study them. And in particular, the international peace movement is almost never studied because it was run by a couple of women. One of the women who should get a Nobel Peace Prize 5 or 10 times if the prize meant anything is Peggy Duff, who very few people know who weren't involved directly, but Peggy, who was a close friend, was basically running the international peace movement for years very effectively. Cora Weiss was another. Her husband is a well-known American lawyer, Peter Weiss. Both of them were involved. And there are a few others. So that's kind of the precursor to the NGOs that have developed in later years. But I think the goal is basically the same. See if the public can be organized and mobilized to escape the controls of the highly effective propaganda system, see the world as it is, become directly engaged in trying to overcome serious crimes, atrocities. The NGOs do often do a very effective job on that.
And do you believe it can be enough, the role of the NGOs, when we balance it to the role of corporations in influencing politics?
Well, kind of a little bit misleading. The distinction between corporations and state power is very thin. There is a distinction, but in practical purposes, they're close to identical. Actually, this was pointed out 250 years ago in the early stages of the modern capitalism by Adam Smith, who was interested, of course, in England particularly, but what he pointed out about England is pretty much true 250 years later, different mechanisms and forms, but pretty much the same. As he pointed out, what he called the masters of mankind, those who own the economy, the modern age corporate system. He said they are the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests, I'm quoting him, that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, meaning they set policy for their interests, no matter how grievous the effects on others, including the people of England, but primarily the victims of the savage injustice of the Europeans abroad. He was concerned particularly with British savagery in India then in its early stages. Well, that's Adam Smith's 250 years ago. It's pretty easily translatable into the modern world. I can look into the details, but there are some interesting divisions that take place between centralized corporate power and state policy, and they're interesting to look into. I've discussed a number of them. I actually just happened to be talking about one of them in a conference a couple hours ago, but in Latin America. But overwhelmingly, they're pretty much the same. So it's not. I mean, there have been efforts to try to induce corporations to carry out a less destructive role in devastating the environment. And it's quite interesting to look at them. We learn a lot about our own society by looking into them. So there's what's called a program of ESG, environment, sustainable governance. And there's been an public effort to induce corporations to adopt ESG programs through shareholder organization and pressure and so on. But it very quickly led to a backlash, interesting backlash. The Republican Party, which is dedicated to destruction of the environment and the interests of short-term profit, has an organization, which you probably know about, called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Members are broadly supported throughout the whole corporate world, strongly supported by the Republican Party. They carry out a very clever programs. They know that at the state level, it's very easy for corporate power to pass legislation. Doesn't take much to buy a state legislator. It costs less than to buy a senator. And the pressures that you can impose on state legislatures are far greater. So they aim for the state legislatures, and they try to get them to pass legislation which will be in the interests of the corporate sector and the more reactionary elements of the state. Many of the things they do are pretty interesting. Like one of the things is, as you probably know, every year there's about several $billion stolen from workers just by businesses refusing to pay what they're responsible under their contract. So refusing to pay overtime, just refusing to pay wages altogether, and so on. It's called wage theft. Amounts to billions of dollars a year. Well, one of Alex's efforts, which has succeeded, is to get state legislatures to ban not only punishment for wage theft, but even inquiry into wage theft. You have to ban inquiry into this banned subject, and they've succeeded. And they have many other policies. Well, one of their policies is to block ESG, to get states to pass legislation which says they will punish corporations by withdrawing pension fund investments and so on, punish corporations if they dare to take ESG policies. And it's been very effective. There's just a recent study that showed that ESG policies have dropped very sharply in the last year or two under this corporate offensive to ensure that corporations will not do anything to improve a livable environment. That's very significant, both in its impact on the future. If they're going to continue poisoning the environment, we're done. But also because it tells us a lot about how the government actually works. It goes back to your question about corporations and government. Here's the way it actually works. Below the radar, you don't see headlines about it. But if you look into the studies, you see it. And you see it on issue after issue. The ESG, the effect, the success of the corporate offensive through ALEC in banning and undermining ESG investment is a very significant fact. That's for its, not only in what it teaches us about how government actually works, supporting Adam Smith's observation, but also because of its very significant impact on what life is going to be like in a generation or so. Notice it never gets discussed or reported. These are not the kinds of things that the corporate media are much interested in.
Yes, and you mentioned ESG, and it is an interesting field that has been particularly significant the last 10 years, where we see, particularly in Europe, that there have been a lot of mandatory due diligence laws. You mentioned that there has been backlash, particularly in the US, but we've also seen laws that have been adopted against the Yuchao region in China, labor laws that do impose a form of mandatory due diligence in for global supply chains. Do you believe that these laws could form a counter on corporations, the field where we're going right now? Not only the small legislations that have been issued in the US, but also the mandatory due diligence legislations that are being negotiated right now in Europe. And actually, I believe the European Parliament is issuing a decision on its position this week. These legislations have an effect on multinationals operating not just in Europe, but also operating in the US. Do you believe that these type of laws can make a change to sort of limit that corporate power?
Well, we can ask how they apply in the United States. We have laws, a lot of laws on labor rights, They're not implemented. There is something called the National Labor Relations Board, but it's been virtually powerless ever since Reagan. Doesn't do anything. Picking up slightly under Biden, but under Reagan and Clinton, it was just essentially nullified, which meant that corporations could carry out all kinds of illegal acts without any, with complete impunity. Whether the Europeans can make these things more effective, we don't know. We should notice that the concern about labor rights in China is part of something else. It's part of the US-run effort to try to prevent Chinese technological and economic development. The United States is quite openly, it's perfectly public, nothing secret about it. That we must find a way to prevent China from developing. And one aspect of this is a sudden concern for labor rights in China, not labor rights elsewhere, like not labor rights here, but labor rights in China. That's part of the campaign against China. It's a good thing to do, but we might look at the history. So go back to go back to NAFTA, under Clinton, 1993, 94. At the time that NAFTA was rammed through over strong public objection in all three countries involved, there were efforts by the labor movement and Congress's own Office of Technology Assessment who developed an alternative to the Clinton version of NAFTA, which is an executive investor rights agreement. They tried to develop an agreement which would include things like bringing in concern about labor rights and so on. That was totally smashed. It was never even reported. And the Office of Technology Assessment was in fact expanded shortly after. Congress doesn't want that kind of information. But so there have been possibilities all the way along, but now they're coming to the fore as part of the campaign against China's development. So the proposals are correct in themselves, but we should look at the context. Can they be implemented? Depends. Corporations have all sorts of ways of getting around them. So for example, let me just take something as simple as corporate investment in China. The Biden administration, like the Trump administration, has tried very hard to get the corporations to decouple from China. And it's very interesting to see what's happened. So if you look at the Asian press, Asia Times, they've done some studies on the flow of the changes in trade in the Asian region since these efforts have been started. Well, it turns out that what they found is that there's a great increase in Chinese exports to Asian countries and Asian countries exports to the United States. What is it to US, under US corporate control? What that means is that the multinationals have figured out a simple way to get around the barriers on direct investment in China by putting up some subsidiaries in Vietnam and Malaysia, which will be transfer points for the same operations. I mean, corporations aren't stupid, you know? They want to make profit. And if the government throws a barrier in one way of doing it, they'll quickly work out a way around it. A little more complex. Maybe they lose a little money in the process, but there's a huge, incredible profit to make. It's kind of a rounding.
And if it's if we assume the laws would not be effective because they would not be implemented, then what can we do to prevent corporations from abusing human rights? What can we do to get corporations to promote ESG?
All the efforts that are being done, but you have to follow what happens. So pressure for ESG made a lot of sense, but it was not able to counter the enormous power of the masters of mankind who found other ways to prevent it, like through the ALEC imposition of state legislations, or what I just described. Instead of investing directly in China, you just make a few manipulations and you get the same results by setting up transfer points. One way after another is going to be avoided. And it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there is a principle which I think I quoted last time, if you remember. It's very important. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War during the First World, under the Roosevelt administration, to repeat, or maybe to say, I forgot whether I said it or not, the country in the 1940s was being mobilized for war. Everyone had to tighten their belts, with one exception. Profits had to flow. And Stimson explained it, said it straight out. He said, in a capitalist society like ours, if you want business to cooperate, you got to pay them off. They have to make profits. That's the nature of a capitalist society. Same here, unless you figure out ways for business, you're not going to achieve the goal. Of course, that doesn't have to be true. Like during the New Deal period, there were restraints on private profit. And in fact, it led to a period of the greatest growth period in American history, early the 50s and 60s, which is relatively egalitarian growth, no financial crises, high taxes on the corporate sector. They weren't poor, they made plenty of profit, but nothing like the savage capitalism that was unleashed. Totally different. So it can be changed, but it takes a lot of work. With the militant labor movement, popular organizations, political parties, and alternative political parties, all of this in the 1930s, and a sympathetic administration did lead to a kind of moderate social democracy of the kind that you find in Europe. It's all changed in the last 40, 45 years.
So we need to make the case that ESG is good for profits. Diane.
That's the Stimson doctrine. He's right. It's basically Adam Smith's subject.
I'm dying to jump in here because I know we're going to get back to the international order, but I want to hold for a minute on this topic we've opened up about putting pressure on the government, whether it comes from NGOs or other places. And civil disobedience is something that I know you, Professor Chomsky, started out doing in the 60s, and actually were one of the leading figures during civil rights and in the Vietnam War opposition. Well, you've just now referred to the Vietnam War as an example of something where there was pressure on the government that was successful. And in fact, the Vietnam War was drawn to a close despite Kissinger and Nixon and the secret efforts to overcome popular opposition. So knowing the importance of civil disobedience to that movement, to those two movements, to other things in history, and knowing that in our first lecture we heard about the imperative to address climate emergency. And also knowing a little bit that you've just mentioned that there's not a lot of sociological study about what does succeed in changing government policy. I wanted to ask you about Extinction Rebellion, which is just now organizing for an April 21 demonstration, and which seems to be the product of a Oxford Union scholar who did an analysis on how to change government direction. What Hallam says is that there, and other people have said it, I think Chris Hedges has said it, we are past the tipping point. There is nothing but provoking a revolution. There is nothing but getting out to the streets. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little about the role of civil disobedience today.
Well, civil disobedience is a very significant issue. I've been involved in it myself plenty of times, arrested plenty of times, and so on. But the point of civil disobedience is not just to show how angry I am. The point of civil disobedience is to achieve some effect, to bring others into some kind of engagement and involvement in the issue. You're saying, I'm willing to go to jail, you do something. That's what civil disobedience is about. If civil disobedience takes the form of, I'm going to go to jail and I'm harming you, you're achieving nothing. In fact, it's negative. Civil disobedience has to take, if it's going to be of any moral, political significance, has to take place in an environment in which is a background of understanding for the actions that lead people, so that the civil disobedience leads people to think and say, well, I ought to be doing that. Well, that's very significant. Go down, take the weathermen in the 1970s, young kids, late 60s, early 70s, enraged about the Vietnam War. So hideous, how can we stand it? So let's go down Main Street and break windows and so on. That just builds up support for the war. That's not the kind of action that has any moral or political significance. Actually, I remember meetings, international meetings that were arranged by Peggy Duff, the woman I mentioned, who basically ran the international peace movement, meetings that she set up in Paris, where we had activists here who were meeting with Vietnamese, talking about tactics and so on. And the kinds of tactics that they proposed were so mild that American activists could barely laugh. So they said the things that they were very much opposed to, violent actions, disruptive actions. They understood perfectly well that this would simply lead to more support for the war. And they wanted to survive. They didn't care whether Americans felt good. But they proposed, like I remember one meeting where some women from South Vietnam proposed that said that what really impressed them was when a group of women in the United States stood in prayer at the graves of American soldiers who died. That's what they thought was an effective action, because that would lead others to start thinking about it. So they didn't care much about whether American activists felt good about what they were doing. There was no interest to them. They wanted to survive. That meant they wanted tactics that would, in fact, lead people, the general population, to start thinking about these things and doing something about it. Well, those are lessons that activists should keep in mind. So take Extinction Rebellion. Done a lot of very good things. They've had a lot of effect, but some of them are negative. So there was, and they're aware of it and changing their tactics. But one of the things they tried, you may recall, was shutting down the metro in protest against failure to the environment. What's the effect of shutting down the metro? It means a lot of work and people can't get to work. That doesn't convince them to do something about the environment. So the negative backlash. Understandable. We're familiar with that too. Take the tactic after the Floyd assassination of defund the police. Well, there's a sensible version of defund the police. It was put forth by the Black Lives Matter leaders, by Bernie Sanders, by Ocasio-Cortez and others. What it meant was shift funding of the police to police actions, not to things that the police shouldn't be involved in, like domestic disputes, or overdoses, lost dog, things that should be done by community action and involvement. That's defund. But even they said pay more to the police, better training, even the police activity. That's a wing picked up. The right wing picked up the slogan and said, oh, these guys want to take the police out of your community and let you free from criminals running wild. Well, you got to be careful when you produce slogans to make sure that the reactionary forces of the country, which of course are powerful, aren't going to pick it up and turn it to their benefit. The slogan, defund the police, well, it had a sensible interpretation. It was swamped and wiped out by right-wing propaganda. Well, you've got to think about these things when you're involved in tactical choices. Tactical choices are not trivial. Tactic sounds, who cares? It's the big thing. But it's the tactical choices that have the human effect. That's why you have to think them through. And that's true of civil disobedience across the board. I mean, there are people who I greatly admire, acts of civil disobedience that I think are harmful. So take the Catholic left, who break into, say, a submarine in Connecticut and smash the nose cones of submarines because they're committed, passionately dedicated, committed to trying to block nuclear destruction. Well, I admire their courage, their integrity. They're people who I think are very admirable human beings, but their actions are harmful. The only effect, since no ground is prepared, was enraged construction workers, the workers at the plant. What are they blocking what we do for them? It's not enough to say God is on our side. You have to ask, what's the impact of the actions we're carrying out? And that holds overall, not just for civil disobedience, but for all tactical choices. I mean, there's a distinction between feel-good tactics and do-good tactics. It doesn't matter whether we feel good. That's not what's important. What matters is, does it do good? Does it help the people who are at the wrong end of the club? That's what we're concerned with.
Great. They're very interesting remarks. And to shift the conversation a little bit back to the world order, one of our audience members asked what a state of anarchy would look like. And another one asked what your views are on cryptocurrency and blockchain. Combining those questions, do you think cryptocurrency could be a useful tool in taking the state out of people's social relationships? And do you think that could be useful in the long run?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I'm very skeptical about cryptocurrencies. I think mostly it's kind of a scam. It's not going to replace currencies that have the kind of backing which establishes trust, which is money and currency are just based on trust, nothing else. Why is gold stored? Because there's trust that it'll maintain its value. If it didn't maintain its value, it's just like sand, you know. And the money can be anything as long as it's trust behind it. Cryptocurrencies, and I think if you look at the record there, a lot of people got in plenty of trouble with them, and I don't think they've succeeded in doing anything. So my own feeling, I mean, there's different opinions about this, but my own sense is that it's a bypass. It's not dealing with the issues. There are important questions about what currencies should be used in world trade. Right now, there are efforts around the world to try to find some alternative to the dollar-based system. The post-World War II international commercial system has been based on the dollar. That's the reserve currency. And the United States pretty much undermined that. And at the time of so-called Nixon shock, when Nixon eliminated the reliance on gold, but nevertheless, the currency remained stable because of U.S. power, but it's tottering today. There are many alternatives. So much of the global sector doesn't want to be bound to the dollar-based system. Remember, the dollar-based system offers the United States all kinds of power, not just in the economy. So, for example, why do take, say, the sanctions against Cuba? It's now since the early 1960s. Shocking, harsh sanctions against Cuba. I mean, if Swiss chocolate uses Cuban sugar, it's banned. You know, if Cuban nickel is used in something, it's banned. The world overwhelmingly opposes this. I mean, even the Organization of American States, which is under the U.S. thumb, declared it to be illegal. European Union tried to bring it to the World Trade Organization so that the WTO would condemn the U.S. sanctions as illegal. Well, the U.S. just told them to get lost. This is the Clinton administration said, none of your business. We decide what we want to do. The United States pulled out of the negotiations. Actually, Clinton's statement was pretty interesting. They said, for 30 years, we've been trying to overthrow the government of Cuba. You have no right to prevent us. So therefore, we pull out of the negotiations. Therefore, you'd better adhere to the sanctions. Because if not, we throw you out of the international financial system. So Europe keeps to the sanctions. Well, a dollar-based currency has those, does have those effects. And much of the world just doesn't want it anymore. So you take a look at the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, China, and so on. They're thinking of trying to work out some alternative currency that can be used in international trade. There's just meetings recently in between Brazil, China, Russia, Indonesia to see if they can set up a currency in which there are no third parties involved in an interaction. Meaning if Brazil has dealings with United Arab Emirates, they don't have to do it through the dollar, third currency. They can do it directly, or maybe through BRICS. But these things are beginning to develop in opposition to the U.S. effort to try to maintain global hegemony. This is one of the things I talked about last time, this conflict between a U.S. effort to maintain a unipolar world in which the United States dominates, versus efforts to create a multipolar world based on the legal framework of the United Nations, not the United States. And I think those are developing issues of considerable significance, I think.
Yes, and our next question is a blunt question, and I think a difficult question to answer. One of our participants asked in response to your comments of last week, if the economic order is now worse than ever, why do more people now have access to more material goods than ever?
We have more iPhones, consumer goods, and much of the population, in fact, the majority of the population is living from paycheck to paycheck. So we have an economy in which a lot of mostly frivolous consumer goods are much more available than before, but you don't have elementary security. You want to get health care, tough luck. We don't provide that sort of thing. In fact, most bankruptcies are because of our crushing healthcare system. You're a mother who had a baby. You want maternal care, maternal leave for a couple of weeks. Sorry, folks, we don't do that. The United States is the only country in the world developed that doesn't do things like that. So yes, there's the kind of economy which is very beneficial to the corporate sector. They like to sell a lot of goods, but not providing the kind of public goods that make life survivable. Not us. That's savage capitalism. So yes, there are a lot of different varieties of iPhones you can buy, but no health care. I mean, technically there is health care. We actually have a universal health care system in the United States. It's called emergency rooms. So you can somehow make your way to an emergency room. You get good care, but that's the most cruel and expensive form of universal health care. But it's the one that's good for insurance companies, private hospitals, manufacturers of medical goods. They want profit, not health. So yes, you can have the latest iPhone, but tough luck if you want something like maternal leave, child care, health care, and so on. That's not our business. We don't make money out of that.
And is there still hope for America? The system is off from a social welfare state, like, for instance, my country, the Netherlands, or Canada. Obama made a good attempt with Medicaid, which is now at risk of being taken away. Where do you see the future of America going? Is there hope for these sort of social protections?
Obama his medical care system was a small improvement of the awful system that existed, but not very much. And notice that Obama flatly refused to consider even a public option, the option of universal health, even though about 2/3 of the population was in favor of it. He said, sorry, we can't do this because of the Stimson principle. You want to pass any legislation, you got to make sure that private capital makes profit out of it. So that's so-called Obamacare. As you know, of course, Republicans are 100% opposed even to that. And if you look at the current House now under Republican control, one of their first legislative proposals, first ones, is sure poor people can't get Medicaid. the way they do this by imposing work requirements. So if you got a poor mother somewhere who's got 3 kids, she's got to go to work to try to get medical for her kids. Of course, she can't go to work. There's no child care. Sitting there with 3 kids and no money. Are you going to work? Are you going to have a job? Have a car? And nothing. But the savagery and cruelty of the class war, where the Republican Party's in the lead, says, sorry, you can't get Medicaid. In fact, there are many Republican-run states which simply refuse to take federal funds. They get them free, refuse to take them because they'll be used. Of course, there's a little footnote there, what remains black. And there's a strong element of racism behind all this. So can we change this? Sure we can. Take a look at what happened in the 30s or in the 60s with President Johnson's Great Society legislation, Medicare, for example. It's not what it ought to be, but it was a big improvement. You can make the current GOP, which is by now so reactionary, can't even find them on the map, but they're trying very hard to destroy even the achievements of the New Deal, like Social Security. They don't say so, of course. They will say, well, we're all in favor. But if you look at the proposals, limit the budget, but of course include Pentagon spending, include corporate subsidies and so on, but limit the budget. Well, just take a look at the arithmetic, what gets cut. They don't want to say. You notice that Kevin McCarthy has not come out with a budget because they don't want to say what they're going to have to cut. They do. The popular opposition will be overwhelming, but it's elementary in the arithmetic to find some devious way to make sure that there's nothing except what benefits the very rich and powerful. Well, that's not some, but it was not different in the 30s. Very powerful. So can it be done? Sure. Well, there's no law of nature that says the United States has to be off the spectrum of developed societies and things as elementary as healthcare. Actually, I just want to make a correction from something that I see was misunderstood last week. I pointed out that the United States is unique among developed countries, any countries that I know of, and that mortality is even increasing. Doesn't happen happening among white working class, mostly. That's unique, deaths of despair, economists call them. And the questioner pointed out that if you look at recent mortality, there's lots of deaths in Russia and elsewhere. That's COVID deaths. I'm talking about the steady death toll, independent of COVID, where the United States happens to have a rotten record, one of the worst. Others are worse still. But the general mortality has been declining even before COVID and independently of COVID. It's an astonishing comment on the richest country in world history that even mortality is increasing among white working class. Does that tell you about the goods that are all available to us? Quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. Indeed, that was one of the questions that we got from the audience on the mortality rate. To bring it back to the world order, one of our audience members asked, do you have a view as to how the Ukraine situation ought to be resolved, which is obviously a very loaded question. And to make it a little more specific, another audience member asked, do you think the ICC will be an ICC warrant for Putin may lead to an actual prosecution of him or have consequences for his leadership?
Well, that's the Ukraine, actually, there was a pretty good article that just appeared in Newsweek by two international relations specialists, which people may not like it, but I think it's pretty sensible. You might want to have a look at it. But just think it through. How can a war end? Well, there's two possibilities. Either there is a negotiated settlement or one of the other sides capitulates, or else it just goes on indefinitely. Okay, those are the three possibilities, just logic. War goes on indefinitely, stalemate, going to wipe out Ukraine. Just take a look at the relative power of Russia and Ukraine, even with US advanced aid. They're suffering very severely, both the economy, deaths, most of their original armies destroyed. They're using draftees, they can't keep it. So the strong possibility is that stalemate will mean slow. A lot of death on both sides, a lot of destruction on both sides, but in the longer term, probably the devastation beyond recovery of Ukraine. That's one possibility. Leaves two other possibilities: negotiated settlement, or one of the other sides capitulates. Well, it's almost certain that Russia's not going to capitulate. They have, if they ever face defeat, which is not a prospect, but if they ever did face defeat, they can up the ante. Remember, Russia had fought the kind of war that the United States fights normally. There are leading international figures like President Biden or Treasury Secretary Yellen, or the Finnish Prime Minister, go to visit Kiev. How many people visited Baghdad when the United States was smashing it to pieces? Not only did nobody visit, but everybody was taken out. UN personnel were removed. Peace activists were removed. It was too violent and destructive. Well, there's a long way to go, even with conventional weapons, to make it harsher and more brutal. Could move to the American style of war. What's happened in Ukraine is horrible enough, but if you look at the facts, it's not on the scale of other wars. Now take a look at the death toll of civilians. We don't know in detail, but the only serious estimate we have is from the United Nations. 8,000 killed. It's a lot of people. It's probably almost certainly an underestimate. I suppose it's off by, say, a factor of 10. Suppose it's 10 times that many. Well, that would bring us into the range of Reagan's slaughter in El Salvador in the 1980s. About 80,000 civilians killed. You're not getting anywhere near major wars like Iraq. We're not supposed to think about that. That's a fact. And Russia, if it ever came to that, which I doubt, has nuclear weapons in reserve. So the chances of Russia capitulating are very slight. Lots of possibilities of escalation. Where does that leave us? Possibility of a negotiated settlement. Well, the United States is opposed to that. The United States' position is got to continue the war to weaken Russia. Fine for the United States, but great. The United States is getting a bargain out of it for a small fraction of the colossal budget. You can severely degrade the military forces of the only military aggregate. I mean, it's openly discussed now in the United States, so obvious. So the United States basically has no incentive to bring the war to an end. It's gaining. In fact, most of the world is suffering from it. countries facing starvation, Europe declining. Not the US is the one country that's gaining enormously from the war. Industries or profits are just booming. Military industry, fossil fuel industry, Europe's in our pocket, enemies being degraded, flying high. No incentives to try to end it. Well, the argument that's given for this, you can read it in the current issue of Foreign Affairs again, is we have to support Ukraine to put it in a better negotiating position. Who says it's going to be in a better negotiating position? It's going to be in a worse negotiating position as it suffers more and more disasters. This is all a cover for saying we don't want negotiations, we're doing fun. You know? Well, how's the war going to end? Think it through. It's not going to be Russian capitulation. If it's a stalemate, devastating Ukraine, going to be a negotiated settlement. It's the only logical option. Will it be undertaken? Opinion here. You try to suggest it in the United States, you're condemned as a Putin lover, appeaser, Munich, and so on and so forth. But we're told, incidentally, that European leaders are all supporting us until you look at the facts. It's not reported here, but the president of the European Council, major organization, part of the EU, just Charles Michel, just said that most European leaders are tending to support Emmanuel Macron in his approach to separating Europe from US control. Well, that's certainly, it's clearly true among the populations. Polls show that strong support for those are the logical options. See what's going to happen. Another, which I forgot already. The latter part of the question was it? The first part was how's the war going to end, but there was a second part.
The second part is, do you think there will ever be a prosecution of Putin, and what will there be the consequences for him?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. All of a sudden, for the first time, US opinion is in favor of prosecuting war criminals. Have you ever heard it before? Who is the ICC prosecuted? Africans. Could the ICC prosecute George W. Bush for carrying out the worst crime of this century? That's beyond inconceivable. In fact, he's honored, respected. The United States even has laws, as you may know, which authorize the president to use military force to rescue any American who's brought to The Hague, even an American soldier. Prosecuting the US for crimes, it's beyond indescribable. US is lauded for crime. Take a look at the perpetrators of the Iraq War. All lauded, of crimes. So could one of our enemies be brought to the ICC? I mean, yeah, should happen. War criminals would be prosecuted, but they're not going to agree. Why should they? And the rest of the world is mostly laughing at this in ridicule. They know perfectly well what we're not allowed to think about. We'll be willing to use legal measures against enemies, but not the US doesn't even ratify the ICC, doesn't even accept its jurisdiction.
And to bring it back to the settlements and the power dynamic in those potential settlements, what do you think would be a bigger driver of any settlement talks with Russia? Would it be its position as a nuclear weapon state, or its position as a state that is rich in minerals?
For Russia, we can't impose any conditions on Russia. How are you going to do it? The only way you can impose conditions on Russia is if you destroy them. So yeah, you want the world to go up in flames? Okay, say so. That's what happens if you try to impose conditions on Russia. How can you get Russia to give up nuclear weapons? I mean, there is talk about that in the United States. A lot of talk about breaking up the Russian Federation and so on. Is there any way that can be achieved? I mean, this is imperial imbecility reaching stratospheric heights. I mean, can you get the United States to give up nuclear weapons? I'd like to see it. In fact, I'd like to see the United States join the International Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. About 120 countries have signed it, but none of the nuclear weapon states. Fine, let's take the lead.
And then we have some questions on technology companies. And the question is, do you view advanced technology companies such as Google, Apple as potential contributors to solutions to climate or geopolitical issues? Or do you think they are more tools for that are powerful to increase control and benefits from existing power structure?
These are private corporations whose goal is to maximize profit, market share, control. They're not the American Friends Service Committee. They're not Amnesty International. They're private, profit-making corporations. Not because they're bad guys. It's just if they stop being that, they go out of business. So that's an institutional fact. So you can't look for them to try to carry, I mean, maybe for some public relations reasons, they might do something nice, but that's just ways of increasing profit, part of the institutional structure. And if they try to do something like the ESG we were talking about, get a huge backlash from the rest of the corporate system, which makes them back off. But should they be controlled? Well, I think so. Well, they can do a lot of harm. In fact, as you may have seen, there was a recent petition signed by a couple of thousand of the leading practitioners and advocates of the current AI technology, calling for a moratorium on their development, because they have plenty of harmful consequences. I didn't sign it myself because I thought it took the technology much too seriously, but nevertheless, I can understand the reasons why advocates of technology want it to be stopped until there's better controls instituted. Can it be done? Not so sure. My own feeling is the genie's out of the bottle. There's no way to control it. And these new developments are fabulous methods for disinformation, for defamation, for preying on people's gullibility. In many cases, people fall in love with their chatbot and ask it questions. People even do it for things like, what are these things called? Alexa and so on, where people will ask it questions and take seriously the answers they get. It can be very harmful. I mean, if these systems are used for things like personal care, it will be a catastrophe. There's far too and for years, there's been enormous amounts of investment in trying to get self-driven cars, but Too many errors. In fact, we have automated systems for detecting missile attacks, very sophisticated systems. Fortunately, there's human intervention repeatedly. Otherwise, we'd all be dead because they repeatedly report erroneously that there's a major missile attack. Maybe something bounced off the moon or something, you know, that nobody thought about. Or maybe there's a computer error, which happens all the time. So there's plenty of extreme harm. You can imagine these systems being used for something, but then you have to design them for utility. It can be done. In fact, I'm using it right now. Take captions, which I use because I'm hard of hearing. Well, basically, that's developed by the same brute force methods. It's quite useful. Methods can be useful, but not when they're under the control of institutions which, by virtue of the nature of the institutional system, must seek profit and power. It's like health. You put it in the hands of insurance, private. Why do you expect it? It's not their business.
While we're on world order, I'm curious about the rise of authoritarianism globally. I think that I've witnessed Mr. Orban in Hungary, Mr. Modi in India. Without going down the list, I wonder if you could comment on whether there is a trend in the direction of authoritarian rule internationally, globally on the world scene, and do you think that is connected?
Well, each country has its own reasons there, but there are some commonalities. One common factor, I think, is the spread of the neoliberal assault on much of the world, much of the social order since the 1980s. That's been very harmful to people everywhere, very beneficial to private power, but quite harmful to the population. Left lots of resentment, anger, distrust of institutions, looking for something to save us. Well, that's where a demagogue can move in and say, I'll save you. Plenty of that. It's different in different ways. In Modi's case, it's Hindu racism. Hindu racism. He wants to destroy India's secular democracy and install a Hindu democracy. It's that of course means undermining and destroying independent institutions, press, universities, and so research, and so on. And it's happening. Orban's Hungary is pretty similar. He's seizing on something that's the counterpart to what's called the Great here, preserving Hungarian authenticity, meaning keeping out anybody. You can mobilize the population to fear immigrants and so on, and also very effectively capturing all instruments of the society, press, universities, so on, under highly authoritarian control, similar to elsewhere. And remember that Hungary is the model Republican Party openly. Orban ran a conference in Hungary of the reactionary movements in Europe, those with neo-fascist origins. Star of the conference was Donald Trump, made a major speech. Republican Conservative Political Action Caucus was a central element in it. Tucker Carlson practically was swooning with praise for Orban's magnificence, made a huge documentary about it. There was a meeting in Dallas shortly after of the Conservative Political Action Caucus. Keynote speaker was Viktor Orban, not hidden. That's a core part of the Republican Party. Even in that, it's a very serious matter that's happening all over the world. Right here, many attacks on functioning democracy here, voting rights restrictions, radical gerrymandering, massive efforts to ensure that the minority Republican Party will be able to be in permanent power. That's the end of functioning democracy.
Let me jump in at that point with a question about the 2024 elections. And there's a New York angle because there are at least two cases we are prosecuting against Mr. Trump. I wonder if you would care to comment.
I mean, he's obviously committed endless crimes, but the effect of the prosecutions will probably be to strengthen him politically. He's a skilled showman, can turn it into a demonstration that the deep state, the evil deep state, is conspiring to take away your leader. So mobilize to support me, even if it means a civil war. Could happen. I mean, whether they should continue. I think that's the likely outcome of the prosecution. I mean, the prosecutions themselves will probably be a tap on the take the Fox Dominion. Fox got away like gangsters. They were charged a fee, which is a small part of their immense profits. They can probably write it off as a tax. And they didn't have to concede that they'd been involved in massive lying and distortion. You know, as lawyers, you know, I do, that white collar is very rarely prosecuted in any serious way. All kind of ways. It's not like some poor guy who breaks into a store because he's hungry. That gets prosecuted.
And leaning on to that, many of the issues, the deteriorating democracy in America, the power of the Republican parties, the upcoming elections, many issues results from the bipartisan system in America. Do you believe that a multi-party system would be an answer to many of these issues that America is facing between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, whereas other countries in the world, such as Canada, the Netherlands, have multi-party systems that have additional sort of counter factors to curb radical thinking in government. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Two-party system makes it a highly autocratic system. Means other voices can't be heard, as in the parliamentary system. If you take something like the British Labour Party, the Canadian NLP, and they couldn't arise in the United States because of the. I mean, there may be a way out of this, but it's going to take a lot of popular dedication and organization. But that's only one of the many anti-democratic elements of the constitutional system. And remember that the Constitution was instituted to try to prevent democracy. No secret about that. As I'm sure you know, the major work on the Constitutional Convention, gold standard in scholarship, Michael Klarman's recent book a couple of years ago. It's called The Framers' Coup, the coup against democracy. James Madison was perfectly explicit about this, the main framer, that we have to have an order. The minority, the opulent, are protected from the majority. It's the basis of the Constitution, sorts of devices to ensure that. In the original system, the most important component of the government was the Senate. Senate, Madison's words, which wasn't, of course, elected for until 1913 or so, but said the wealth of the, it represents the wealth of the nation. It's the more responsible set of things. Those who have respect for property owners and their rights. They don't, he didn't say property owners, they say property, but of course property has no rights. It's the property owner. That's quite apart from the slavery and so on. That was the framework of the Constitution, and it remains. And, you know, so I don't have to tell you this, everybody knows it. You know, Wyoming and California both have two rivers. Electoral college is highly democratic. But all of these are kind of minor in comparison with Adam Smith's insight. The concentrated private power are the principal architects of policy. They have overwhelming power. The nature of policy is not 100%. As I say, they're interesting breaks, but very, it's overwhelming. I mean, there's very studies of this in the mainstream political science literature, showing that most of the population, maybe 70% or so, is just not represented, the voters, because their own representatives pay no attention to their opinions. There's no correlation between what they want and what their representatives vote for, because they're listening to other voices. You're elected to the House of Representatives. First thing you do is get on the telephone to ensure the donors that you're not going to do anything that will harm them. Meanwhile, a bunch of corporate lawyers are descending on your staff headquarters and overwhelming the staff and pretty much writing legislation which you sign. I mean, a bit of a caricature, but not much. So there's plenty of democratic features just built into the stuff. Can be overcome, but by a lot of work. Great, I'm going to have to go off to the next one.
Yes, it is 5:20. I think we need to wrap. I'm looking at the last questions from our last session. And I think we can be out by 5:30. Is that okay?
Sure. Okay, let's.
The questioner asked where you foresee a change is possible in the world order, any hope or solution going forward.
There's always hope. There are opportunities. There's many barriers, but nothing that can't be overcome. I mean, remember, we have two fundamental issues, crucial issues. If they're not solved, everything else is moot. One of them is the rise of nuclear war, both in Europe and Asia. Second is destruction of the environment. We don't deal with this in the next generation, next couple of decades, doesn't matter what anything else is, we're finished. Is there a hope for these? Yes, there are feasible means to overcome them. But one thing that's going to happen is there is going to have to be accommodation of some sort among the great powers. China, United States, Russia, the other BRICS countries are going to have to accommodate, because these problems have no borders. They're common problems, have to be dealt with by common means. And that's just a given. If that doesn't happen, nothing else is going to matter. So can it happen? This is going to be, I mean, go back to the question about the negotiations. Could there be a negotiated settlement on Ukraine? Well, the position of the United States is can't have a negotiation which rewards aggressors. Really? Where did that principle come from? Nobody believes it. Has anybody said you should sanction the United States for invading Iraq or destroying Libya, or one thing after another? Of course not. So nobody believes in the principle, but they all proclaim it nobly. Okay, that's part of the crime of the educated sectors, to claim adherence to principles which you don't believe for 1 second. You only use them as weapons against others. Now let's take a look at the history of diplomacy. It's interesting to think it through. Let's go back to 1815. France was the aggressor, had invaded, largely destroyed large parts of Europe. France was defeated. There was a settlement, Concert of Europe. Did it punish France for its aggression? No. It brought France into the system as an equal. That was the accommodation at the Concert of Europe by statesmen. They understood that there's not going to be any peace in Europe unless France, the aggressor, is brought into the system. Well, that led to about a century of relative peace, not total, but pretty peaceful by European standards. That's a pretty substantial achievement. Compare that with the Versailles Treaty, where which essentially took revenge against Germany and punished Germany severely, didn't bring it into the system. What did that lead to? The rise of Nazism in the Second World War. Well, these are facts about diplomacy. You want to feel good, destroy yourself? Yes, those are options. You want to solve problems, make a better world? You have to think a little, not just say, I can take revenge. That has to do with what a possible future can be like.
Yes, that is interesting. And we've seen that, of course, in various peace agreements, not to mention, for instance, the Colombia peace agreement, where this was a big issue on the table. Is there punishment? Are we going to punish, or what form of, how are we going to imprison FARC members that have committed aggression? And ultimately, very mild amnesties were a big issue in those peace negotiations, though we would think with Russia, the consequences of the aggression would be more severe, also in terms of, and I think this will be the last session, but their seat in the Security Council, their seat in, the global world order. Can we just assume that that the future can remain the same, that the status quo can be maintained after there's a potential settlement, maybe only because we have limited time to address the Security Council seat.
Well, first of all, let's settle a fundamental point. Is there a single person who has any access to the public arena who believes that aggressors should be punished? There's an easy test for that. Find somebody who thinks that George W. Bush should be brought to the ICC and that the United States should be sanctioned. See if you can find one such person. I can't. It therefore follows that there is no one who believes the principles that are proudly proclaimed. It's a pretty significant thing. Everybody pompously issues the noble pronouncements. Not a single person believes what they're saying. That's a comment on the entire educated class. So let's put that in the basket when we turn to the next question. Nobody believes the principle. Well, can anything be done in the Security Council?
I just, if I can push back on your first question, whether Bush should be prosecuted, I actually would argue that a lot of people believe that. I actually would argue that that's perhaps the reason that the United States never joined the Rome Statute of the ICC.
No, that was, I believe it, you believe it. What I said, is there anyone who can speak in the public sector who believes it? Try to find one statement in the mainstream media, in the international relations literature, in scholarship, in the American Journal of International Law, any source you like, find one statement saying that US aggression should be punished. It's a challenge. See if you can do it. I can't. That means nobody who has any access to the mainstream in education, scholarship, media believes it. Well, what about the Security Council? There are proposals to allow to modify the United Nations structure so that there would be ways for the General Assembly to override a veto by various technical means that would allow the General Assembly to pick up issues where the Security Council is blocked. Now, if you read the commentary here, it's all about how Russia blocks the Security Council. Take a look at the record of Security Council vetoes. It's a very interesting record. Go back to the early days of the United Nations, early 50s. Russia was blocking everything. And there was a reason. The United States was so powerful, it could use as the United Nations as a way to batter the Russians. So of course they were vetoing everything. Well, as decolonization continued, the United Nations got more shift. It's the United States that's vetoing everything. It's a long period in which almost all the vetoes of the United States, even vetoed resolutions calling on states to observe law, because it was understood they're directed against the United States. Then in more recent years, you start getting Russia vetoing, but the record is quite interesting. So are there ways around this? There might be. There are ways for the Secretary General and with General Assembly support to develop mechanisms that might overcome the case where major atrocities continue and because of vetoes that against dealing with them. Could happen, but the great powers are going to have to agree to it. Can't do it unless they agree. Is the United States going to agree? It's pretty hard to imagine. The United States does not accept any international intervention and go through this. rarely signs even the enabling conventions in the General Assembly. I mentioned the World Trade Organization. When Europe tried to get the World Trade Organization to consider the legality of the US embargo against sanctions against Cuba, Clinton said simply, it's none of your business. We're trying to overthrow the government of Cuba. If you don't like it, too bad, get lost, pulled out of the negotiations. International Court of Justice condemned the United States for what amounts to international corruption. The United States just told them to get lost. None of your business. We're going to escalate. And they did. The United States is not going to agree, as it currently constituted, it's not going to agree to anything. And the US didn't even agree to, I think I mentioned the Genocide Convention. It's not applicable to the United States. It's, until we change the United States internally, there isn't much hope for any positive US role in efforts to get around this Security Council's stranglehold. We can't do much about Russia and China. We can do a lot about ourselves, since we play a major role that can have an effect.
Those are wise words to end their conversation with, and give everybody in the audience, I think, a cause of action, because changing the US, as we noted, I think, in the first part of our panel, is that public opinion and civil society play a huge role in changing the US internally. So I think our audience here has work to do based on your words.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank
Sorry,
you very much
take off, but I've got others coming.
making the time for us.
Bye.
Thank you again.